Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Ancient Warfare Answers with me, Murray, your weekly fix of ancient warfare-related ranting by me, where I attempt to answer a question from a reader, viewer, or listener. You can ask me a question. You can back us on Patreon, one of three different levels: Legionary, Optio, and Centurion. Even get a copy of the magazine. You can ask me a question by commenting on a previous video or podcast, by sending an email, murray@carvanserai.publishers.com will get to me, by sending me a postcard, PO Box 222 Belfield 2191 Australia, NSW 2191, or indeed, as has happened here, yelling loudly in the street. Now, my ears were burning, and indeed, S6 is my handle, I believe. Thank you, S6. I just yelled out loudly on Ann Street in Brisbane CBD. How did Greek hoplite, this is all in all caps, by the way, how did Greek hoplite phalanx maintain kilometres-long cohesive moving lines of troops while marching forward into combat on terrain where there would be trees and bushes and fences? Did they have a method of reforming parts of the line when small bands would get slowed down by obstacles? For example, the line to the sides would slow to allow gaps to reform, or the soldiers were trained to run back after they cleared obstacles, or were they following individual commanders who would tell them to run reform? Anyway, I am now at the Brisbane CBD police station for psych evaluation. Now, I think I said earlier that my ears were burning. I knew that someone somewhere was yelling out a question to me. So if my ears start burning, that will be my sign. Right. So the interesting thing about that is, of course, we envisage these incredibly long lines of hoplites advancing. And the reality is probably they're not that long. Some of the evidence we have for that about the depth and frontage of ancient armies is a little bit piecemeal. We only get bits and pieces here and there. But in some cases, we get very precise detail. Vegetius and Polybius, for instance, give us the frontage of various armies, both Roman and Hellenistic, and Vegetius of Roman armies, later Roman armies. Vegetius, of course, is recording the antique legion, the ancient Roman legion, so it's difficult to know which period he's talking about. But in very basic form, at the closed shield closest formation that we have, Sinopismos and things like that, it seems to be 45 centimetres of space for a hoplite or a Hellenistic phalangite. And generally in a wider, still close order, but not the closest order, it's 90 centimetres width, and we get the idea in Vegetius and Polybius of 90 centimetres depth as well. And so the interesting thing there is that 90 centimetres per person across the front it doesn't actually give that greater width to a line. Polybius seems to give up to 1.8 metres for open order, which of course increases the amount of width. So there is this accordion-like width of a ancient army. There's also, of course, depth. Now, I think we've talked about in the past the idea that at the Battle of Issus, Alexander advancing in terrain that doesn't fit his entire army across doubles the depth of his phalanx, and then as he advances into a more wide open area, he makes the line the correct depth, which of course implies a whole bunch of orders being given, received, and acted upon where these units would go into the right place, which of course implies a great deal of time to get them all in order. Again, there's several instances where Roman commanders, or Roman unit commanders rather than the overall general, stops an advance, redresses the line so that they're all in the right place for the final advance, the final charge, for instance, which, again, when we think about warfare the way it's shown to us in film, it's pell-mell running rather than disciplined trot in formation. So I think probably more that than a pell-mell charge, even though on cinema screens with orchestral score in the background, it's very rousing to see people running at each other without, a thought for their own safety. Of course, in reality, there's no orchestral soundtrack in your head when that's happening. Although, again, how loud was ancient battle is one of these big debates. We get the idea that some of them, the Athenians, scream and yell as a way of geeing themselves up as they charge, whereas the Spartans impressed everybody by advancing in silence, which of course implies, I've said the word implies a lot, implies that they're silent because they can hear commands. Now, getting back to the idea of how did they maintain kilometres long lines of cohesive moving troops? And the reality is, so for instance, at the Battle of Delium, we are told by Diodorus that the charioteers and footmen, this special unit of 300 members, which seems to connect to the later Sacred Band 300, that's a different topic, 300 men and a depth of 25, which comes from Thucydides. Now, a depth of 25, 300 frontage gives us 7,500 men in the army. And again, according to Thucydides, the number of Theban Boeotian hoplites at the Battle of Delium is 7,000. So 7,500 men deep is not that great a depth. 300 wide is only going to give you a very small amount of actual frontage. If you've got 90 centimetres per man, that's 270 metres wide, which is not particularly wide. If it's 45 centimetres across, so that if they're in closed shields order, that's only 135 metres. So that is a much more concentrated width of men. And if there's relative silence, no, blaring brass and orchestral sounds, and again, we need to remember that the paean is being sung and the flute is being played. Now, flutes don't have a great carrying power, and yet we think that the ancient armies used the flute as they advanced to give the step, which means that it's relatively quiet and you can hear for a relatively long way. So if you're in the middle of that closed shield 135 meter wide formation and you yell your commands to left and right, they're only having to go 60 something meters. So it's not that far. If you've ever tried to yell a long distance, it actually isn't that problematic, especially when things are quiet. And so that idea is really interesting. Now, I've done some maths. Now, if you know me, you know that I shouldn't be relied upon for maths, but I did check it. So here we go. So what you have in hoplite armies is an average depth of 8, anywhere between 6, 12, we occasionally get 16, and then occasionally 20 and deeper. The Phalanx at Delium being 25, the Phalanx at Leuctra, according to Diodorus, 50. According to Xenophon, 50. Now, again, the interesting thing there is at Marathon, for instance, there's 9,000 Athenian hoplites. If they're 8 deep, then it's 1.125, 1,125 meters across. If it's only 45 centimeters per man, sorry, is that right? Yes, sorry, it's 1,125 men across. So 9,000 men, 8 ranks deep is 1,125 men across. If they're occupying 45 centimeters each, it's 506 meters, not particularly wide at all. If they're occupying 90 centimeters, and again, in Herodotus, we're told they run for not less than a mile between them and the Persians. So again, is it a run? Is it a pell-mell sprint? Or is it an ordered run? Cinematically, pell-mell sprint suits. Probably more likely it's an ordered run in time with some kind of music. But even so, even if it's a run and they are occupying 90 centimeters each, then they're only 1,012 meters across. They're a kilometer across. The reordering, if they're going to slow, make sure of the line and then charge, that will come down to the individual commanders of the Lochoi or the Taxace in various different hoplite armies to make sure they're in line, listening for commands. When you look at the Spartan breakdown of the commands, every group of the Inamotia onwards has a commander who presumably is going to tell their men what to do and where to be, so that you've got, a Lokagos, a Taxiarch, and an Intermotarch. So they're all going to tell their individual men where to be. And those orders are not going to need to be heard particularly wide. If you've got if you're 6 ranks deep and you're only 32 men and you're in Inamotia, you're only 5 men across. So that makes, giving orders, receiving orders relatively easy. Now, when we come to the Romans, again, Vegetius and Polybius give us these. You've got a maniple in the Republican period, 120 men wide, 6 ranks deep technically, so 20 men wide. So it's 120 men, 6 ranks deep, 20 men wide. At 90 centimetres per man, that's 18 metres. So it's not a particularly wide formation. If it's 1.8 metres for an open order, then it's 36 metres. If it's closed, closed shields, and again, anywhere between 45, maybe 50 or 60 centimetres, you're dealing with only 9 metres across for that unit. Now, when you're getting to the Imperial Legion, we get an average of between 3 and 8 ranks deep in terms of the depth of the line. And again, those variations are based on terrain, available area to deploy in, and these obstacles you're talking about, that if there's a ravine or a boulder or a tree or something like that you have to move around, then that moving will occur. And then after that obstacle is surpassed, you will then redress the line. So, for instance, if you have a legion of 5,120 infantry, if it's 3 ranks deep, then your frontage is 1,706 men, which, if it's 45 centimetres per man, you're dealing with 767 metres across. If it's 90 centimetres per man, it's 1,535 metres across, 1.5 kilometres. And again, that seems to be much wider, but again, you're dealing with a century. So if your century of 80 men is 8 deep, it's only 10 men wide. So that makes it much easier. If it's 3 men deep, then it's obviously going to be slightly wider than that, about 15, not quite. So if it is 8 men deep, then you're only 640 men across for a legion. And if it's 45 centimetres, that's only 288 metres across. 576 if it's 90 centimetres. So this idea, and obviously in some of these consular armies, you've got legions across. And so a roughly average consular army, 2 legions and an equal number of allies, is estimated it's going to be 1.5 kilometres across for the entire army, which is not actually that excessive. And so, in a sense, the idea of how wide these armies are going to be, we need to bring it down into a much smaller idea of width. Depth, different story entirely. But when you look at some of these battlefields like Leuctra or Cannae and things like that, the idea that these armies could fit into this space, and some people have attacked these battlefields as being unlikely to hold the number of troops and therefore revise the number of troops down, entirely possible. But again, some of the depths tell us that the men will fit on a battlefield that's actually remarkably small. So I think in that sense, you've actually got a whole bunch of not only line width and line depth ideas going on, but you've also got an officer and for lack of a better term, NCO cadre that are making sure that the line stays in order, that they reform, that they form a solid line, because obviously in these shield warfare, the solid line is the important thing. So I hope S6 is my handle, yelled from Brisbane. I'll yell it back out again and get back up to Brisbane. It is quite some distance between Sydney and Brisbane, although most of you are probably listening on the other side of the world, so it's much further. Anyway, I hope that answers your question, and you can join me again for another episode of Ancient Warfare Answers. Thanks. Bye.